Okay, so I am presenting on Lady Damaris Masham. She was a philosopher. She was born in 1658, died 1708. She was the daughter of Ralph Cudworth. He was a Cambridge Platonist. So he taught at the University of Cambridge, and then he also had one published work. So he was a philosopher. It ran in the family. She also had access to a really good library. Education-wise, they don't really know much about her education. They do know that she learned French, which was appropriate at the time for her being a gentlewoman. And then also she taught herself Latin later in life using Locke's method called Some Thoughts Concerning Education. So she and Locke were very close. When she was about 23, she met Locke, this was 1682. Initially, their correspondence was romantic, but it didn't pan out. But they stayed very close friends, and they corresponded a lot about life and philosophy. And then later, at her behest, Locke ended up living with her and her husband on their estate. So she was married in 1685 to a widower, Sir Francis Masham, and he already had 9 children. And then she married him, and they had one son together. She also corresponded with other philosophers, so she was really close to John Norris, who was a prevalent philosopher at that time. But eventually her ideas differed from his, and so they kind of became philosophical adversaries. So at this time, it was like Lady Masham and Locke were really close together, and she was kind of like under Locke, I guess you could say. And then you had Mary Estelle at the same time, and she was close with John Norris and did stuff with him. So, and these were like kind of two opposing sides, I guess you could say, in some ways. Lady Masham, she wrote 2 books. One was A Discourse Concerning the Love of God, and that was 1696. And this was written in response to Estelle and Norris, kind of critiquing some of their works. And then there was, she also wrote Occasional Thoughts in reference to a virtuous or Christian life, and this was published 1705, and it was written in response to Estelle. So, Norris and Estelle, they were idealists, and then Locke and Lady Masham were more empiricists. And so Lady Masham was more about sensory experience, and that's how we learn of God and things like that. So the love of God comes from these experiences that we have. And then and Estelle and Masham, even though they're seen as kind of opposing philosophers, there are a lot of similarities. That they were both Christian philosophers, they were both proponents of education and women. It just kind of comes from different ends of the spectrum. There was also, I was reading an article by Simone Webb, and she talked about how in Masham's correspondence with Locke, she would kind of, maybe rant isn't the right word, but she would talk a lot about how her daily duties and housework and all these things would get in the way of her philosophy. So even though in her philosophy she was Masham was for sociability, so said, the experiences and being social with people is a good thing. In her letters, she's kind of saying a different thing, all these people and duties and housework and chores are keeping me from philosophy. And that's how Estelle was. Estelle was against sociability, so that's kind of interesting. That's one way that they could be seen as similar. Okay, so moving on to the next part. Okay, so for the second part, I chose to read, look into Occasional Thoughts in reference to a virtuous or Christian life, and that's the excerpt I gave. So in this, she talks a lot about reason versus revelation. And it's kind of, she's answering the question of like, if you really need revelation, or if you can use reason. And she kind of goes back and forth and shows why you need both. She starts by talking about education for children, and how children, she says, when they're not taught rationally, so they're basically just taught, believe it because I say so, and then they are shamed for asking questions. And then she says later in the years they just throw it all away because they don't have that good foundation. So in here she defines virtue, and she says, quote, virtue being defined as regulating our passions and appetites. So that's what she's talking about with virtue. And so she's talking about developing these virtuous people. She talks about how you need both habits and truths of religion in order to be virtuous. And you need both because truths of religion give you the motivation to keep, to live virtuously. And then habits, when you have good habits, they allow you to accept the truths of religion. So she talks about how when children are young, they need to have these habits instilled in them first, even if they don't quite understand yet. And then as they learn, they need these truths of religions taught to them so that they can rationally accept them. Because she talks about how over time, as your judgment grows and you're able to reason through things and see these good truths, so do your passions. And your passions kind of dictate how you're actually acting. So there's that like dissonance with people. And so going on, was without knowledge of true religion. Yeah. So then she talks about how you can. She talks about how you can know like the laws of God through purely through reason. Technically, right? So she says that whether you learn it through reason or through revelation, they are both just as true. But there's buts with the law, with learning things through like reason and just through reason and a natural light. Because she says that very few are able to actually discern by natural light. And then people who do discern, by the time they discern the laws of gods, they already have these built-in bad habits instilled in them. Which is why she's saying, kind of plugging in, that you need revelation so that as you get these truths right away, you're building good habits along the way with the truths that you learned. So moving on, so talking more about revelation and if you actually need it, she says, okay, so she starts talking about what we can actually know through just nature, or the light of nature, so just by reason and not revelation. So she kind of goes through and says, what can we know just with our faculty of reasoning? And here, so some of the things she talks about in this excerpt that we can learn are, she says that we can learn that there is a first cause, and that first cause is an intelligent being. And she doesn't go too deeply into it here. I feel like she's basing it on other philosophers at this time. But she says through reasoning we can understand that because of our creation and that we're here. And then also she says that we can know that this intelligent being is good because as we live here on earth and we experience these things, we find happiness and we have this endearment and attachment to the experience that we have here and the things and the people and stuff. So this goes back to empiricism and being like, we learn about God through our sense experiences. So it's very practical. And then she also talks about, we learn that God is an invisible being. And she says this because we've learned that he has these attributes. He has power, wisdom, and goodness because we're created and we're happy here. At least our experiences can make us happy here. And so these attributes can't just be floating around attached to nothing, like they have to be in some kind of substance. And so that's how she reasons that God is an invisible being. Okay, so I went over time, But that's my presentation. Those were some interesting things I found about Lady Masham. So thanks.